again. I get a few people asking me about collecting Ray Bradbury works, and the funny thing is I don't really consider myself to be a collector, which is a weird thing to say when I've got all of these Bradbury books behind me. But to me, a collector is somebody who is quite systematic in their collecting, and I'm not really very systematic. Most of the things that I have in my collection are things that I've picked up along the way because they were useful to me at any given time. Now, I first started collecting Bradbury stuff back in the 1970s when I was a very wee lad, and the first book that I ever read that was Bradbury was Golden Apples of the Sun. Now, I don't have the original version of that I first ever read, and the reason for that is because it was a school book. It was only given to me for a term or a year, and then I had to give it back. But the second Bradbury I came into possession of was one that I bought myself. I found it in a jumble sale, I think in a church just around the corner from where I lived, and I probably picked up a few comics on that day as well, because that's what you do. You go to a jumble sale, you buy all sorts of rubbish. But I came across this book by Ray Bradbury, and it was the second time I'd seen his name on a book. The first time was Golden Apples in a classroom. The second time was this paperback, which I found in a church jumble sale. And I've still got that book today. It's in a bit of a tatty state now, but I've still got it. And here it is. This is the very one. It's got this strange cover, that guy with the muscly chest and forearms. But actually, I think this is a really good cover. It shows the story The Scythe, and it's about this guy who goes out, cuts down the wheat, but it is effectively killing people as he does so. It's a very weird story, but it's quite powerful as well. And if you look closely at the design, you see there are people drawn into the wheat here, and they're in pain and agony. It's quite a striking image. Now, as I say, I don't really consider myself a collector of Bradbury, but when I began to really systematically read through Bradbury's oeuvre, that's a good word, the books that were available to me at the time were the British paperbacks from Panther or Granada, and I've still got them. So for instance, there's this version of Dandelion Wine with a cover which has almost nothing to do with the book as far as I can see. It shows somebody hanged from a tree. I don't remember that in the book. Then there's this one, which in a way is quite a rarity now. It's the Silver Locusts. Now, American viewers may not know the Silver Locusts, but the Silver Locust was the British version of the Martian Chronicles. The book was retitled when it was first published in the UK, and the British version was slightly different to the American version. And over the years, the British maintained this title, and the Americans maintained the Martian Chronicles, until around 1980, the TV miniseries based on the Martian Chronicles came out, and then all of a sudden, the British paperbacks shifted over to the title of the Martian Chronicles, trying to tie it in with the TV series. And I've got a whole load of these Panther or Granada editions. This is probably the most hideous of them all. I'll give you a close-up of this one in a moment. This is The Small Assassin. Again, a cover that's got nothing at all to do with the story. So whoever was putting these covers together really hadn't read the books, or if they had, they didn't care. But let's have a closer look at some of these. There's The Small Assassin. Now, the problem with The Small Assassin cover, the story, as you possibly know, is about a murderous baby, but it is not about a murderous robot android baby, which is what's been shown on this cover. So I think this is absolutely hideous, or at least it's hideous in this context. It does not in any way match the book, so it's really misselling to put that on there. It's not even a science fiction book, it's a collection of horror and fantasy tales, and even the back cover in the small print categorises this one as fantasy and horror, so I don't know what they were thinking in putting that on the front of the book. But these Panther or Granada books form, I suppose, quite a nice uniform series. Long After Midnight, Machineries of Joy. And my two favourite covers from the series are this one, The Illustrated Man. I just really like the kind of silhouette image there. And this, undoubtedly my favourite cover of any Bradbury book, I think, the Fahrenheit 451 edition from this series, where the flames of the artwork seem to be burning away the book itself. I think that's a genius cover, and I've always liked that one. So these are all of a similar vintage. I came into possession of all of these early to mid 1980s, and the copyright dates on them are around that era. So the Fahrenheit 451 there, that was a 1980 printing, but I think I probably came into possession of that around mid-80s or something like that. So it looks like I'm a collector here because I've got this uniform series, but it's not completely uniform. I think a true collector would make sure that they got the first edition or the first printing of each one of these, whereas some of these I've got the first, some it's the 10th. You know, there's no system to these. These just happen to be the British paperbacks that were available at the time that I bought them. So I don't consider myself a collector, but I've got most of them. I don't think I have all of them in that series though, just most. Now, what other things have I got that might make me look like a serious collector? Well, I've got a few from this series, which are William Morrow hardcovers. I kind of like the size of these. They're not enormously big for hardcovers if I compare them to a 1970s paperback, for instance. So they're not much bigger. So I find these quite nice for fitting on shelves. And I've only got a few of these though. Some people have got the whole set. I don't particularly like the artwork on these, and nor do I like the fact that they've got these, I forget what this is called, but this kind of rough edging on the pages, which is something you tend not to see with British publishers. Very few British publishers will put out a hardback with these edges, so to me that looks most unpleasant. But this is the closest I come to having a uniform series of Bradbury hardbacks. I don't have them all, I just have a few. And these date from 2006. Now, what I do have that marks me out as a collector is a few limited editions. But again, I don't systematically go chasing after every limited edition of every book of Bradbury's. What I've tended to do is go for things which are really quite unique. They're one-offs, in that the book is not a reproduction of an earlier work, and nor is it a book that's likely to become a sort of mass market paperback. So these tend to be books of scripts or books of rare manuscripts that may be unfinished things. So for example, there's a limited edition of Ray Bradbury's Masks, which would have been a novel, but it wasn't a novel because he didn't finish it. It was an early work. But the manuscripts survive, so they were collected together and published as a limited edition book, Masks. And there's been a few of those over the years, and there's also been quite a few that publish screenplays, and because that's something I personally am very interested in, film and film writing, I've collected quite a few screenplays over the years. Now, this book is one that both delights me and frustrates me. There's something about the binding that collects dust. It's impossible to keep this book clean. And I don't believe in putting books in bags on the shelf, but this one is frustrating because it is called The Martian Chronicles, the complete edition. So you would think that this is complete, wouldn't you? You'd think there's nothing missing from this. But in fact, it's not complete. It's a collection of some Martian writings by Bradbury, but not all. But it is a limited edition, 224 out of, I don't know, 1,000 signed editions. And what this book contains, it's got a few glossy pages of artwork, which is quite nice. It's got some introductory material by famous authors, John Scalzi, Joe Hill, Mark Scott Zicree, Richard Matheson. And it has the complete contents of the Martian Chronicles, but this is one of the ways in which this is not really a complete Martian Chronicles. The version it collects is not the original version of the Martian Chronicles. This is the 1997 revision with the updated dates, and the story Way in the Middle of the Air is taken out. So this is not even the Martian Chronicles, it's a later revision. What it then does is collect other Martian tales, and this is where you get Way in the Middle of the Air and various other stories that are set on Mars or appear to be set on Mars. In the final section of the book we have the screenplays, and you would assume, because it doesn't say otherwise, that this contains all of the screenplays for the Martian Chronicles, because it's the complete edition. But it doesn't. It includes 2 screenplays, and Bradbury wrote more than 2 screenplays, so they've been selective, but they haven't told you what the selection criteria are. And in fact, the book doesn't tell you who edited it. So as a book that calls itself the complete edition, I think it has to be more transparent. It either has to be complete and unequivocally complete, or at the very least it has to have a sense of an editorial presence where the editor tells you what the policy is for including things within the book. And here's another limited edition. This one doesn't declare itself on the cover. You have to open it to find out what it is. It Came from Outer Space. Now, It Came from Outer Space is a film, and so this has Bradbury's original film script, which he wrote back in the 1950s. Again, limited edition, so signed by Bradbury, and this is number 155 out of 750 copies. Now again, if you're not into film scripts, you wouldn't even go anywhere near this book, but it actually reproduces Bradbury's manuscript. And as you can see, it's got corrections in it, it's got Bradbury's handwritten notes all the way through, so it's quite a fascinating historical artefact. Now, all of the pages that are reproduced in here are held in the archive of the Centre for Ray Bradbury Studies, and I've had the privilege of visiting there several times, so I've seen the original manuscripts of this screenplay and the associated documents with it. Nevertheless, this is a fantastic resource for anyone who's interested in the history of that particular film. So I keep arguing that I'm not a collector because I'm not quite a completist, I'm not thorough enough, and I don't own everything that Bradbury produced. But now I'm going to show you some pulp magazines, so that possibly means that I am a collector, because I think only a collector would bother collecting physical pulps. This is a Planet Stories, and you can see I keep post-it notes on these just to remind me of what's in them so I don't have to open them. This is the Planet Stories issue from 1946 that contains Million Year Picnic and Lorelei of the Red Mist, and in fact that's the cover story. It's named down the bottom, but Lorelei of the Red Mist by Lee Brackett and Ray Bradbury. For anyone who doesn't know, Lee Brackett was a friend of Bradbury. They were very close in the 1940s and onwards. Lee Brackett is probably more famous today as a screenwriter. She wrote a number of major Hollywood films from the 1940s onwards, but if she's going to be remembered for one thing, it's going to be Lee Brackett, the writer of The Empire Strikes Back. The only other 2 pulps I possess are this 1948 edition of Thrilling Wonder Stories, which does not have Bradbury on the cover, and this 1950 Thrilling Wonder Stories, which again does not have Bradbury on the cover. In 1950, Bradbury's second book came out, The Martian Chronicles, so he was just on the brink of becoming a big famous author, although his stories had already appeared in a number of magazines that were much more prestigious than these pulps. People sometimes ask, why are they called pulp magazines? Is it because they print pulp fiction? Well, yes, But it's not that the magazines are named after Pulp Fiction, it's that Pulp Fiction is named after the magazines. If I take this one out of its packaging, and there will be true pulp collectors who watch me do this and will say, you shouldn't do that, you're touching it with your bare hands. Well, it's mine, I'll do what I like with it. So this is my Planet Stories, and they're called pulp magazines because they are made from very cheap paper. The cover here is very flimsy now on this one, but if I show you the paper, it's all rather brown and aging. So I'm just looking at that on my monitor there. So the pages, the paper itself is very cheap paper. It doesn't age very well, and pulp magazines have a reputation for falling apart. Now, my own experience of handling and looking at pulp magazines is actually they survive remarkably well. This one that I'm holding here is from 1946, and it is still pretty much in one piece. Having said that, I have seen some pulp magazines that have turned pretty much to dust, and I think it's just a matter of how they've been stored over the years. So let's have a closer look at this one. So we're looking at Planet Stories from 1946, and I'll open the cover gently, and you can see the cover is virtually coming away from the rest of the magazine. The pages in these pulps are often held together with staples. This is part of the original manufacturing process, and these will often rust if the magazine isn't stored properly. And the pages themselves, it's a bit like a newspaper. It's rough paper of really very low quality. They're made out of wood pulp. They're not made to last. It's not like a book that was expected to be published, put on a shelf and then kept for years or generations. The pulp magazines were considered to be disposable. And I think if you asked anybody working on this magazine back in 1946 whether they expected any copies of it to survive into the year 2021, I think they would be extremely sceptical. And yet, here we are. So here's The Million Year Picnic by Ray Bradbury, but also at the top, Lorelei of the Red Mist, Lee Brackett and Ray Bradbury. So that's probably a big coup for Planet Stories. Both Brackett and Bradbury were big name writers as far as they were concerned. And if we turn the page, we get to artwork that accompanies Lorelei of the Red Mist. Now, not every pulp magazine had artwork inside, but a lot of them did. So Planet Stories, Thrilling Wonder Stories, all of those, they generally have some really interesting illustrations. And unlike the paperback illustrations of the 1970s, where they would choose almost a random image and couple it with a book, in these pulps they tended to be custom drawn for the story. So this is an actual illustration for the Bradbury story, The Million Year Picnic. It's not a random drawing, it is illustrating a scene from the story. I consider it quite amazing that they would go to those lengths with the artwork when these things were considered to be ephemeral and just weren't expected to be collected or kept or anything like that. And when you contrast the interior illustrations with the exterior artwork, which is always in these bright, garish colours, to me there's a world of difference there between the outward face that these pulp magazines were projecting in order to attract readers and purchasers, with the quality artwork inside, which really looked as if they cared about the stories. One of the other fascinating things about the pulp magazines, especially science fiction pulp magazines, is that many of them had very active and energetic letter columns. So readers would read the stories, they would then write in and give their opinions. Now, I suspect the editors of the magazines were very grateful for any correspondence they received, because that gave them content for the magazine. But way before we had the internet, this was a way for fans, science fiction fans, to link up with each other. Many of the pulps would publish the full address of the letter writer, and that gave people a means of contacting each other. and that's got to have played a big part in the establishment of science fiction fandom and the formation of the first conventions, which were, I think the first World Science Fiction Convention was around 1939. So, there you go, a handful of pulp magazines. I don't think that makes me a collector, but if you disagree, let me know. So what Bradbury items have you got in your collection? Tell me in the comments, I'd really love to know. And in the coming weeks I may pull a few more items off the shelf and talk you through them, but coming up next in Bradbury 101 will be an overview of The Illustrated Man, which is Bradbury's 1951 short story collection. And then after that I'll be doing something on Bradbury the stylist, so talking about the style of Bradbury's writing and what makes him a good writer, a great writer, or an overwriter, depending on your point of view. Don't forget I have a website, bradburymedia.co.uk. Check me out there, and I'll see you next time on Bradbury 101.